Thank you.
And yeah, I've been doing a lot of Agile coaching for organizations and training for organizations, large and small, for a long time. And in fact, been around before Big A Agile was around, and we were doing things like Tom Gilb's Evo and other aspects of the lightweight methodologies before Capital Agile brought them all together. So today I want to talk a little bit about some different scaling frameworks, the big ones that we see, but also distill out of those scaling frameworks some common practices and principles and thinking that I see across all of those. So we don't necessarily have to adopt any one of the frameworks to think about some really good practices that can be applied to help us in our scaling endeavors. So we'll talk a bit about the challenge. Large is large and large is hard. We'll talk about less, Nexus, safe, and then I'll move into that conversation of common considerations. And then one of my big practices, my favorite practice that I use all the time. We'll talk about that as well, and then some conclusions, and we'll open the floor for questions. Feel free to enter things into chat throughout if something really jumps in your fancy and you don't make sure you don't want to forget it. So we're here talking about large enterprise projects, large enterprise products, large enterprise organizations and systems, and large projects for the software industry have always been significantly harder. We have seen large be more of a challenge when we were more of a waterfall industry than we were an Agile industry. And the shift to Agile certainly brings some great things in terms of really great practices at the teams that can help us build upon those, really good foundation at the team aspect. But it doesn't automatically solve for the things that make large projects harder and more complicated. You've got a lot more dependencies across all of these teams. You have more backlog items. You may have more backlog items that require multiple teams to do work together, depending on how you've organized your structure to actually be able to deliver your value of a feature or an epic. You've got to make sure that you've got some estimation and making sure that you understand the size of the work that we're going to do so that we can plan the work and track the work and have good progress visibility throughout. And that's certainly much harder to get when you're talking about 25 teams or 50 teams or hundreds of teams rather than just a single team. And there's generally way more stakeholders. And we've said for decades in the industry that hard is just hard. And in fact, if you look at project outcome rates by project size, it becomes really clear that, yeah, large is significantly harder. If you look at things that are really pretty small, you're looking at, 500 to 1,000 lines of code, those are radically successful consistently. As you start to get into the size of systems that are like medium size of usable business system, 50 to 100,000 lines of code, the odds are still pretty good, but you're certainly seeing some challenged and late projects show up more there. And then suddenly, as you start to get into things that organizations would actually consider to be really large, 500K to 1 million lines of code, the picture suddenly shifts to be drastically different. Now our odds of being on time or early and being successful are significantly lower, and our odds of being challenged or late or outright failure are quite high. The rate of failure is about 30%, the rate of delivery is about 40%. So you've got a better than even chance that you're going to be troubled, challenged, late, or actually fail at those larger sizes. And the industry's rife with stories about this, right? People can talk from their own experiences. We can look at things like the Denver airport or healthcare.gov or the IRS's modernization project. And we see in spades that things just become much more complicated and much more difficult as system size gets significantly bigger. And I always joke that it's pretty much every organization I've been in that has a next gen project. Where I'm usually brought in year 3 of a 2-year project, and there's really no end at sight for that effort. And one of the dynamics to think about here is that large projects are actually fundamentally different animals. If you look at some of the data about where the percentage of our time is spent, in smaller efforts, a lot more of that time is spent in the construction and the detailed design of what we're doing. As you get larger and larger and larger, you're moving more from, instead of that's 2/3 of our effort and our focus, it's more like 1/3. And now we need to think more about system testing, integrating all of those pieces together and making sure they all work together and that we're providing end-to-end business value. Much more focus on architecture, much more focus on requirements. So not surprising, you look at something like Agile and scaling Agile, and you look at using Scrum and Kanban on the teams, and it works great on the teams, but you also find that you have additional information, that you have additional infrastructure, roles, activities that you need in order to really make sure that you're providing all of the support necessary to do all the work for larger projects. So if you want some additional information on these and more, Steve McConnell actually did a lunch and learn a while ago called Challenges of Size, Differences Between Small and Large Projects, Software Projects. And he has all of this information, including the sources and more. So that's a great resource to go to if you're interested in that. Or email me after and I'll send the studies. So a lot of scaling in 2001, people were talking about, Agile really is used only for small projects, although I would disagree. In 2003, I was working with a team that had 9 Scrum teams building internal software for a drug manufacturing organization to manage their drug portfolio. So, right, even that, not huge scale compared to what we see today, but certainly not a single team. What we've seen is that over time, Agile has become so mainstream, it's become the modern way of developing. Of course, now we're going to look at how do we scale it? What are the practices we need? What are the roles we need? How do we make sure that we can be successful when we're looking at many, many teams working together? And high quality adoption of Scrum or Kanban at the team level is certainly critical. I talk about building on a broken foundation. Or an organization that I once was in who said, well, the Scrum thing didn't work for us, so we're going to try SAFe instead. And SAFe is built, like all the scaling frameworks, on the idea of high fidelity adoption, good implementation at the individual team level. But that alone is not sufficient. And certainly one reason why we continue to see more and more scaling frameworks come up, more and more approaches come up, people thinking about and spending more time trying to solve all of these problems. So Jay, maybe we can quickly get a sense for what people are seeing as their biggest significant scaling challenges with that first poll. And if you aren't scaling, don't have to deal with all of that, certainly go ahead and choose non-applicable.
Yeah, Jenny, so it's up there. Everyone select, wait a couple minutes. We're getting a lot of, hits here. Cool. And then we'll close it and I can report the results if you want.
Perfect.
Okay, I think I'll end it if everyone's okay with that. Looks like it's kind of slowed down.
Yep.
So, ready for the news?
Ta-da!
So by far the largest one was handling dependencies, 45%.
Not surprising, you see that a lot, especially if teams aren't feature teams or microservices, and there's a lot of work where you need many teams to build a part of it.
The second biggest one was delivering customer value incrementally, 23%.
One of my favorite challenges. I actually love to work with people to help them do that. That's a big thing I see often. I always joke, if you've got a year-long project, if you're halfway through, you should be able to show me half of the value you thought you were going to build. And a lot of people don't. So That's not surprising to me, nor I'm sure anybody else here.
So rounding out the bottom is not applicable, 18%. And you got 9% getting good progress visibility and 5% building high quality products. No one selected creating working software for Google. That's not important.
Well, maybe people were also thinking of part of that delivering customer value piece. They're certainly awfully interrelated. All right, well, let's start our brief tour of our scaling frameworks. Let's talk about LESS first. Brief history of LESS, you're looking at the work of Craig Larman and Bas Vode, who in 2005 kind of teamed up together and started working and wrote a couple books in 2008 and 2010. And now you can find their thinking and their evolution on top of those books at less.works. And certainly LESS and the Nexus, which we'll talk about next, really do have this focus on we are scaling Scrum. We are finding ways to sort of make Scrum handle more work and more teams together while it still looks and feels an awful lot like a Scrum team. So we've got a single product owner who's going to work with up to 8 Scrum teams. Les definitely puts a strong focus on wanting these teams to be mostly or completely feature teams, so the teams can deliver something that's meaningful. Each of these 8 teams can do that. There's a single shared product backlog that all of the teams are going to be working from and pulling their work out of. And then the events in LESS look a lot like Scrum. We're going to start with some backlog refining. We're going to make sure that backlog is ready for all of the teams as we go into our planning activity. And this approach is either kind of a multi-team activity where all of the teams or representatives from the teams are coming together and looking at this backlog in totality, breaking down items, clarifying items, getting items ready for the detailed sprint planning that's about to occur, or may break off into subgroups that are doing some activities. It really varies depending on what's in the product backlog and what the teams do, how this gets structured. But it's an important activity to make sure, just like in Scrum, that the work in the backlog is really ready for the teams to pick up and begin executing. Then we'll go into sprint planning. You know, if you're 3 teams with LESS, maybe everybody's there, but as you get into 8 teams, generally what people will do is every team will send 1 or 2 representatives. And in sprint planning, they'll really be picking the pieces of the backlog they're going to take to their team and do detailed planning on. So we'll take these 6 product backlog items as team A, and team B will take these 8 items. And from there, they'll go back to the whole team and do what looks like Scrum sprint planning. They'll do the detailed planning there, really make sure and validate they feel comfortable that they can make the commitment to what they've pulled off of that shared product backlog, and adjust that commitment. If they need to pull in a little bit more work or push out a little bit more work, do that, and bring that all back together to the final, yes, this is what we're going to do inside of this upcoming sprint. And then we have our sprint execution. This is going to be all the normal work of getting stuff done, building whatever we're building, testing it, validating it, documenting it. We're going to tie a ribbon around all of it at the end. We're going to do a sprint review across the work of all of the teams for what the entire group produced in the sprint. So there's no idea here of individual Scrum team sprint reviews. We are doing a whole product review of the work we did. We'll bring in stakeholders, interested parties, the product owner, maybe all, but typically representatives from all of the individual teams will come to this sprint review. The retrospectives are going to have an interesting little pattern because we're going to start first with the individual teams doing a retrospective, followed by then them sending a representative, maybe the Scrum Master, but perhaps the person who actually best provides the context for the challenge or the concern that that team has back to an overall retrospective where we're going to look at the challenges that all of the teams are seeing and talk about what we can change as an overall less team to improve together, to be better together. So looks a lot like Scrum. If you're scaling this up into what is called less huge, you will have a single chief product owner. Then you'll have area product owners, and each area product owner will have up to 8 teams underneath them. So we've basically taken the pattern that we just saw and then adding a single decision maker, that chief product owner, to make the decisions across all of the area product owners. We really want area product owners to be customer centric so that the area product owner and those teams can deliver something that's valuable. So decomposing these into components wouldn't be what Les would want you to do. It would want you to do something that is a meaningful chunk of business value from our customers' perspectives. And then each of the Les's here operates as we were previously looking at, with that area product backlog being what they're really feeding, and then the area product owners working with the overall product owner to make sure the right things are in those area backlogs. So Less is a really great fit for companies who do Scrum today and are looking for the simplest possible way to scale Scrum up. Scrum feels really natural. We just want to add a little bit more infrastructure to it to help support and enable 8 teams or multiple Lesses working together. The biggest gap that people will talk about is that it doesn't include any guidance or consideration for things like portfolio management or other aspects that you see people talking a lot about if you're looking at DAD or looking at something like SAFE. That's really just not part of what Less has in its infrastructure in great detail today. There's certainly some mention of it, but nowhere near as much guidance as you'll see in some of the other frameworks, or one other framework in particular. And the most common criticism that I hear and I feel is that the product owner is spread too thin. So if the teams all have really great business knowledge, they have a deep ability to connect with the customers, they're good at writing user stories as a team without the product owner there, Less can be a great fit. If you've got an organization where teams really need the product owner to provide that information to them, then you're going to struggle with Less. It's going to be a real challenge because the teams just don't have that ability to build a good backlog, and they need more product ownership guidance. So that's Less, and next is Nexus, and Nexus looks an awful lot like Less, but there are some interesting nuances in it that make it different and I think are interesting. Less is our friend Schwaber, so one of the 2 co-founders of Scrum, co-creators of Scrum, first released the Nexus guide in 2015, and certainly has been pretty prolific, both in the Scrum framework and in writing books over time as well. The thing that's interesting about Nexus that I actually like, I think this is a nice pattern, is there's an idea of a Nexus integration team. And the Nexus integration team has our product owner, has a Scrum Master. That Scrum Master may be dedicated to the Nexus integration team or the knit, or may be part-time on the knit and part-time on one of the other teams. And then it has 1 or more knit members who also might be members of the other teams that are part of the Nexus. However, their primary responsibility will be to helping make sure that the Nexus integration team is successful. And the Nexus integration team is accountable and responsible for enabling all of the other teams to create a done increment of work. This doesn't mean that they do the work themselves. It means that they help through coaching, through tooling, through practices, through looking at handling dependencies and working with individual teams or team members to get those resolved. They enable that integration step to be happening within the sprint boundary. And that work takes priority. If they are also in a Scrum team, that work takes priority over their development work or testing work inside any one individual team in the Nexus. And so I think that's a really nice focal point and a really nice way of talking about how important, and in some places, how challenging it is to really integrate the work of multiple teams within the sprint boundary. And so this, I think, is a nice focus that Nexus brings to the table. The structure here is that we have the Nexus integration team, and we have that single backlog, and then we have 3 to 9 cross-functional teams that are working together to deliver a product or a system or a solution from that backlog. There's a range here rather than kind of an up to, and it's a matter of how efficiently the teams can work together. So if you're working great at 5, but now you try to move to 7 and you're struggling completely and it's falling apart, then 7 is probably not the right number until you understand, identify, and improve the challenges. They're standing in the way of 7 teams being able to work together. You probably need to go back to 5, figure out what those challenges are. Maybe there's more infrastructure you need. Maybe you've got issues in the continuous deployment or delivery pipeline. Maybe there's too many dependencies. You need to find a better way of handling those. So there's really a range here, and then the guidance is to make sure that you are working together effectively, and once you have reached a point that you're not doing that, then you've gone too big. And again, 9 would be the top model that they see working well together. Key events in Nexus start with sprint planning. So this is really a short coordination meeting to discuss the big picture, talk about the overall goals for this sprint across all of the teams, talk about any interdependencies, and every team is representative by 1 or more people from that team coming together. Then the teams go into detailed sprint planning to make sure that they understand what they plan to do, and what they plan to do needs to be aligned with and part of that common goal across all of the teams. There's a single Nexus sprint backlog that's created that also shows these dependencies. So there will be 1 sprint backlog for all of these teams working together. Once we're in and executing, there'll be team dailies. There'll also be a Nexus daily, where the Nexus daily is very focused on dependencies and integration activities that are happening. And again, the sprint will end with a fully integrated product that goes into the sprint review, where representatives from the teams will get together with the product owner and with stakeholders and interested parties to show off the work across all of these teams and what they did in totality. The retrospective looks similar, but a little bit different from what we looked at in LESS. So here we actually start with a subgroup. We have representatives from the team along with the product owner talking about what was working and what the challenges were. And often, because of this Nexus integration team, very much focused on the integration activities and the dependency activities. Then the individual teams will work. The representatives will go back, talk to the teams about what was working well and not working well at the team level, but also what was uncovered and discussed from the Nexus level retrospective. And then we'll close it by coming back together with the representatives and the product owner to really make final decisions about what we're going to change as a Nexus from the feedback that we've gotten through this whole retrospective process. And of course, there's also refining here. So refinement prepares backlog items for sprint planning, identifies dependencies between teams. The specifics here are really left up to what makes the most sense for you. How many sessions do you have? Does everybody participate? Do you do subgroups? So a lot of the patterns that we were looking at and talking about in LESS are also patterns that you can use inside of Nexus as well. So very similar animals with a few nuances. So one of those nuances is this idea of visualizing and having that single Nexus sprint backlog. So we're looking at the work across the teams and really focusing on visualizing where there are those dependencies across the team and what the teams need to work on. So I think a nice focus to expand upon. So what do people typically say about Nexus? Well, Nexus gets basically the gaps, the criticisms, and the concerns that less does. They're very, very similar animals with slightly different nuances and focuses from my perspective. I see a lot of the same patterns emerging out of both of these frameworks. And now for kind of what I call the big kid on the block. And now for something completely different. So the Scaled Agile framework definitely is a very different animal from LESS and Nexus and has a lot more in it. I actually feel in some ways that I have been following Dean Leffingwell around for decades, watching both his Agile requirements training and teaching that he was doing at Symbian and then Nokia, and watching that the diagram in the back of that book evolve into the very first safe version and then evolve since then. So he's been doing work in very large organizations for a long time. When I was doing some work with Symbian, it was about 1,000 people working on a phone operating system. You get into Nokia and you're looking at 3,000, 4,000 people working on phone suite families. So the Scaled Agile framework definitely came out of the world of very large work. And I joke, if anything, he's been doing more and more with bigger and bigger things. So there's a lot of really interesting things in here, but also you need to be careful to use it where it's size appropriate. I wouldn't bring SAFE in for 5 teams. I think there's a lot other easier things like using some of the scaling patterns and practices that I'll share with you to solve that challenge. So the heart of SAFE is this idea of the Agile release train. 50 to 125 cross-functional staff who can deliver value. So they're able to actually have an element of something that is meaningful from a business perspective that they can work together to deliver. It's a long-lived set of teams. We're going to keep them together. Maybe we'll slightly adjust how many people are on an ART, but we're not going to stand up an ART for a year and then tear it down and have it disappear. We're more going to be adjusting, potentially adding a few people in an ART where the business is focused more and we have business growth, maybe moving a few people off an ART where we're end of lifing particular areas slowly over time, but they are meant to be together for long, long periods of time. SAFE brings in some roles like systems architect and release train engineer above and beyond what Scrum thinks about and offers, to think about that big picture across a whole bunch of teams. And one of the key rhythms is that planning cadence, the idea of a fixed program increment, typically 8 to 12 weeks in duration. 10 is the most common one that I see people using now, where we plan and then run within that cadence. And we have a program backlog that has our features that we deliver inside of each of those program increments. So the key roles on an ART are going to be your Agile teams, your Scrum teams, your Kanban teams who are really going to deliver that work. That might be deeply technical work, or we're seeing some of the things in 5.0 where they're talking about Agile teams providing business infrastructure that's part of delivering an entire solution into the marketplace. So a little bit more flexibility of these teams aren't necessarily just software teams or hardware teams or firmware teams. They're any kind of team in the organization who's using an Agile methodology. We have our release train engineer who's responsible for, they're the servant leader and the coach really for the entire Agile release train. They facilitate the ART events and processes. They help the teams in delivering value. They communicate with stakeholders. They're working to make sure that the program backlog is really ready for the upcoming PI planning activity that we're going to do. They're helping the train learn and grow and improve over time. One could almost think of this as an Uber Scrum Master, and I think you'd be pretty spot on. We have our systems architect and engineer who's responsible for defining and communicating the technical and architectural vision and giving people guidance. They may even be responsible for identifying enablers that go into the program backlog that build up an architectural runway that other teams will consume. So maybe this is a small team who's actually building those enablers for other teams to use, or maybe it's just guidance that's feeding into the Agile teams to build enough architectural runway that you're not starving or having collisions because you don't have enough infrastructure or architectural available for you to build the features and functionalities that you want. And then product management has a seat at the table. When we looked at LESS and we looked at Nexus, there's a product owner, but there's no product manager. So I think one of the reasons that a lot of people like SAFE is there's a seat at the table for the product management folks. Their responsibility is defining and supporting, defining that program backlog to make sure that it has the right features and functionality that drive us delivering value inside our program increments as part of the Agile release train. The PI delivery, the PI boundary is a big deal. We're gonna end each PI with an innovation and planning iteration. There we're gonna do prototyping, spikes, infrastructure, skills development, other things that we need to really prep for our upcoming PI. You may need to do some final integration testing and documentation that cannot be completed within each sprint. Years ago, if you had looked at SAFE, they actually used to call this the HIP sprint, the Hardening Innovation and Planning Sprint. But they got a lot of flack for calling it a HIP sprint. And really, if you are using this entire sprint for hardening, there are technical issues and practice issues that we really need to up our game on so that we can be doing much more of that work incrementally every sprint inside of our program increments. And then we'll also do our art level process improvement meeting here. So we'll have what's called an inspect and adapt meeting. This will be everybody on the train getting together to talk about what's working and what's not working and what we can learn, change, and improve for our next PI. And of course, we also need to plan for our next PI. So part of this innovation and planning iteration is doing our PI planning for our next program increment so that we can then just move straight into the iterations where we're going to be creating working integrated testing software or product. Maybe it's firmware, maybe it's solutions, maybe it's systems that require firmware and hardware and software all coming together. We'll create that incrementally based on the objectives that we set in PI planning. We'll do system demos to test the integration of the full system and get feedback from our stakeholders. Generally what happens is if we are in PI 10 and we've just finished sprint 1, sometime between right now this moment and before PI 2 or sprint 2 closes of PI 10, we will do this system demo to get feedback. So it's not necessarily right when the sprint boundary ends, but the goal should be as close as possible to when the sprint boundary ends so that we can get our feedback and validate the work across all of these teams coming together. SAFE does have the concept of release can occur at any time. So we have a planning rhythm and cadence, but releases are independent and decoupled. Most of the organizations I see using SAFE actually need multiple PIs before they have enough value to warrant going through a release process. So this is definitely built into the framework, but in a lot of places, people need to aggregate up several PIs, 6 months worth of a PI, or I've certainly been in organizations where it's more like a year's worth of work, where they're really just starting their DevOps journey and have a long ways to go towards being able to release at any time. So PI planning is a big deal. It's a 2-day event. It used to be an in-person event. You can now see guidance from the Scaled Agile community about how to run this 100% virtually. The idea was to get everybody together in a room, or if you're geographically distributed, do this over 2.5 days, where you have the, say, West Coast people, East Coast people in the US and India, all getting together for planning sessions that have a fair amount of overlap, but also have some individual work that they'll do as part of this integrated planning effort for the next PI. Inputs include the business context, a vision. Has anything changed in terms of the vision of what we're trying to bring into the marketplace? A roadmap, this may be a multi-year roadmap, or if you're in a smaller organization, it's more of like a 3PI forecast roadmap of what we're doing. And then the concept of a top 10 feature in our program backlog, so the team knows 1 to N, what are the top things that we really are trying to deliver in this program increment. The outputs are PI objectives. So what is the entire ART, the Agile Release Train, trying to deliver inside of this next upcoming program increment, along with the team's objectives? What is the team doing as part of delivering towards those larger program increment objectives across our whole train? A program board to help model and look at what are some of the dependencies across all of these teams working together. And then a top 10 risk list that we roam. So here you're seeing an example, and if you're interested, you can go to the Scaled Agile Framework website and get this in probably a more readable format than my slideshow. But what you're seeing here is the iterations inside of the PI, and the red indicates significant dependencies between teams, and the blue indicates when features are actually being delivered. So you'll see red items that are dependencies tying into the final delivery of a blue item, which is your feature. And the last thing out of it is roaming your risks. So you're going to want to make sure that something is owned, accepted, mitigated, or resolved. So making sure that you talk about what are the risks for this PI and what are we going to do with those particular risks. But wait, there's more. If you're really big and you have lots and lots of these arts needed to deliver value, maybe you have a supplier and you have 2 or 3 of these arts needed for a very large solution, then you're going to have solution trains that run above the individual art trains. This is definitely at large scale. So now we're something that is quite big. You'll even see if you go look at the Scaled Agile Framework, has a nice little picture and it has a box at this level that says extra large, because now we need to add additional infrastructure and roles. So we have multiple arts underneath it. We need somebody thinking about the architecture. So we need a solution architect who's talking to the architects on each of the trains to make sure that the necessary integration of the architecture across those is happening. We had a solution train engineer. This is basically the release train engineer at the solution level, coordinating with all of these parts and pieces. Solution management, looking at the program backlogs of all of the arts and making sure those are integrated and aligned, and the work of each of the arts is coming together into something meaningful at the solution level. We're also going to add more events. So in each art will now do PI planning still like they were before, but before and after the arts do their planning, we'll do solution level PI planning. So we'll do pre and post PI planning at the solution level, where the solution train is thinking about, here are all the program backlogs going into the teams, here's how those aggregate up into value, here's what we think the trains are going to be able to do, and then coming back together after the trains plan and adjusting the plan if more work was added or some work was taken out from what we initially thought we were going to do. We also now want to do solution demos. So an art demo, a system demo still makes sense, but I need to see the whole picture. So I need to see the integrated work across all of these trains in a solution demo. So you can see we've added another layer on top of what we were building at the essential level or at the program level for the Agile release trains. And then finally, above the release trains, and if you have them above the solution trains, is our portfolio level. So here we're looking at things like strategic themes that capture where the enterprise is trying to go, provide context and vision for all of the teams to make their decision. We talked a lot about features at the art level. At the portfolio level, we'll be talking about epics. So epics are something that will take multiple features to deliver a larger piece of business value the organization's thinking about from a portfolio level. how are solution trains integrated with business user stories? So the solution trains are going to add a layer between the epics and the features that the teams are doing. So those features are typically at the Agile release trains, those features are typically then broken down into user stories that the individual teams are working on. So I'm not sure if that was the question that was being asked or not. If it wasn't, maybe when we get to the Q&A, let me know and I can clarify further. So the portfolio backlog captures the highest level and really the upcoming business focus of the organization that's going to feed the trains. Also, if there's anything that's needed from an architectural perspective, you're going to have architectural enablers up at this epic backlog that's going to be managed that then feeds all of the trains to do the work that the organization sees as the highest priority for where it wants to go. So SAFe has a lot in it. You can start, and I usually do recommend in consuming it to look at the essential framework. That certainly has a lot in it. Many people will start a SAFe implementation by standing up a couple of arts and then adding in things like solutions and portfolio management after they have stood up several arts. So that's a really common pattern. This is a good way of kind of getting your feet wet with the framework, because the entire thing can be a little bit overwhelming to start consuming. Obviously, SAFe does multi-day trainings in the Scaled Agile framework, so there's a lot to wrap your head around in all of the details that are in here. I really do think if you're very large, so I've been in organizations where like 500 people deliver a system or solution together, 1,000 people deliver a system or solution together. We have several of those, and so we're going to stand up multiple trains, and that makes a lot of sense. I think if you've got that kind of complex, very large product or program, that SAFe's a really good fit for that, and a lot of SAFe becomes relevant. One of my favorite things to do, which we'll talk about next, is to look for some of the patterns that are keys inside of something like SAFe and use those in places where maybe all of SAFe isn't a perfect fit, but maybe the concept of, say, a program increment. Or I had one organization I worked with who used it, called it a cycle. And that idea of shorter convergence, because they had very long one-year releases, and we wanted to make sure that they could converge to a shippable, potentially shippable product on a much more regular basis. So there's certainly times and places where I find aspects and elements from SAFe are useful for me, even when I'm not bringing it in totality. Biggest gap, not optimized for very small organizations or teams. And certainly it's aimed at large product development where multiple teams are working together. So you may have a very large organization, but the largest combined effort is 2 or 3 teams working together, and that's not SAFe's sweet spot. That's not what it was built and optimized for. A lot of people will criticize SAFe as being very heavyweight, very prescriptive, not very agile. And certainly, you know, you can implement SAFe in a way that is very bureaucratic, very heavyweight, not very agile, but you can also implement it in ways that are very agile. It really comes down to, in my experience, how the organization adopts it and thinks about its adoption. So just recognize where it came from, what the size implications are for it, and then recognize the drive to thinking about how do we make sure we continue to really harvest the benefits of Agile as we bring in larger scale items. So Jay, maybe let's do a real quick poll on the SAFe aspect. Who's using what elements of SAFe, and non-applicable is certainly the first one.
All right, I'm launching. Cool. We're in the poll, and then this time I'll actually show the results before we talk about it.
There's only an option to choose one answer.
Oh, is it choose one? Oops.
Yep. So,
Okay. Well, I guess we'll see where the heavy lifting is.
I think I pushed the wrong button when I created it.
There's also a little check mark for the polls, and it can be easy to, I think the default is choose one, not pick all that apply, so easy to overlook.
Okay, I think frequency is reduced, so let's end it. Let's share the results. And if you want to talk about it, I'll let you talk about it instead of me intertwining.
It definitely looks like there are a fair number of people who aren't using it. So we do have a scaling framework poll. So let's get a little bit into the scaling process and some common aspects that I see out of all of them. Let's do another one where we can get a sense for who's using SAFe versus less, Nexus, Scrum at Scale, and some of the other scaling approaches. So I'm not surprised to see Agile release trains and Essential SAFe being kind of the heavy hitters. I am a little surprised to see, given your focus on enterprise, to see as high of a percentage of non-applicable as you have, given this is definitely the big kid on the block for the scaling frameworks.
And then notice I added design thinking just for you, because they just added it in 5.
I'm very happy to see things like story mapping and personas and user journeys and all of that being thought about in it. It's not surprising. SAFe seems to like slurp everything that's interesting and useful up into one framework, right?
Yeah, and lean portfolio management is another one that's fairly new, although many of us have been doing portfolio management for years.
Yeah, and I mean, it's always had portfolio management up there. I think there's just a little bit more focus on it. I haven't, in the enablement activities I've been doing, it didn't look like they'd made massive changes in the portfolio management level to me.
No, but they called it something else.
Yeah. SAFe 5.0 definitely has a lot of renaming in it. All right, so let's talk about some of the common considerations. I'm a firm believer in having a toolbox. I am not a one-size-fits-all process person. I love Scrum a lot, but it's not the only tool I use at the team level. I use Kanban a lot. I've worked with people to full-on implement SAFe. I've also worked with a lot of organizations to pull pieces of it. I've also been in a lot of places where I usually just look for what's the right set of practices and techniques to use for you in your unique situation. So one of the things I look at a lot is thinking about what are common considerations and common practices that I'm seeing out of all of these that you can use without having to adopt one. You can simply look at your situation and say, hey, these practices make sense for us given our current challenges, our situation, and our need. So one of the common considerations is, of course, thinking about delivering customer value. When you're looking at a SAFe PI, they want you to have something that's meaningful to the customer at the end of the program increment. If you're looking at LESS and Nexus, they want something meaningful to the customer at the end of every sprint. The more we can think about that, the more we can decompose our work in ways that allows us to incrementally deliver customer value as often as possible, given our constraints and situations, the better. So there's a strong focus there in all of these. There's a big focus on building a working product throughout, right? At the end of a Nexus sprint, you have the Nexus integration team, that's gonna have working software. If you're in SAFe, you've got the system demo where you're making sure that it's integrated within, at least within the next sprint after you're done. A big focus on quality, making sure that we have practices, techniques, attributes that really help us build quality in throughout. I've been talking for decades that quality is an enabler. It's a huge passion of mine. I think people don't recognize it, embraces it as much as they can and should, although DevOps makes my heart sing in the fact that it really raises the bar on the quality game of a lot of the organizations I've been in, and that desire to have that continuous deployment, continuous delivery pipeline makes this need clear in spades and really causes a lot of change in some organizations I've been in. The need to get frequent product level feedback, that just getting feedback at an individual team level is not enough. I don't want to look at the bark on the trees. I want to actually see what we're building. I want to see that path through the forest. I want to know how the work of each of those teams contributes to a larger whole. So things like the system demo, things like the sprint review that is the entire Nexus, wonderful techniques for making sure that we're getting this kind of feedback. And then ensuring that we have product level collaboration, right? One team working alone is not enough. If you look at something like Scrum, Scrum has built-in collaboration moments. The daily Scrum is a built-in collaboration moment. The sprint planning meeting is a built-in collaboration moment. And all of these frameworks are adding multi-team built-in collaboration moments to make sure that we are planning together, that we're building things together, that we're working through our dependencies together. So I see a lot of these as focus areas when I'm looking at how well systems development or solutions development is happening in organizations. I'm looking for how well they're doing in these different aspects. And then I'm thinking about how they're doing from a seeking continuous excellence. Are they kind of stable state and have been there for 5 years? Are they really a learning culture that is looking to continually say, how do we do things better and better and better over time? So thinking about how well your teams or your organizations or your clients do these, and then helping find some practices that can up their game is a big thing I'm thinking about and looking at from a scaling perspective. So commonality number one is this idea of alignment. So a strong preference for feature teams so that that working team can deliver an increment of viable business value. One of the things I and some colleagues of mine at Construx have joked about for forever is we're always trying to dissolve dependencies if we can, right? Rather than managing dependencies, we want to dissolve dependencies. And so if we can put things like feature teams in place, maybe not 100%, but more of those teams being able to have soup to nuts ownership across the work that they're doing so that they can individually deliver a piece of value, the better. That team can now take ownership, can take accountability, can plan its work, doesn't have to, well, we're the middle tier layer. First, the database team has to finish their work, then we'll build upon it kinds of things. Having a decision maker. So whether it's the product management group with the program backlog and safe, or a chief product owner who's the ultimate decision maker across all of the teams, we need somebody who's thinking about the big picture. I was in an organization once that had 7 or 8 Scrum teams. It had product owners for every one of those Scrum teams. The product owners had real strong interests in the kind of work that they were doing. But when I went to senior leadership and asked them what the most important thing they were supposed to deliver that year, none of the product owners had that on their backlog, because it wasn't that interesting to them. And they didn't have a chief product owner who was ultimately saying, no, our top level priorities across all of the teams are this, and you need to help contribute to this as much as you can as a team. So that idea of aligning across the requirements that we're feeding into the team is a really important step to take. Shared cadence. 10 years ago, I would have said this is a huge problem all over our industry where people are on sprints that don't synchronize up. Nowadays, I almost never come across people who don't have. We're all on 2-week sprints. We end our sprint on Wednesday afternoon and start it on Thursday morning across all of our teams. So making sure that we've got that integration moment where we can bring everything together. The sprint level, and if we have something above it like program increments, having a shared program increment across multiple arts is really important. Commonality number 2 is a really strong focus on technical practice and quality practices, making sure we have a good game here. Continuous integration, and above that, moving to things like building a continuous delivery or continuous deployment pipeline, and adding things like feature flagging, where we can break that tie between what's it mean to deploy versus what's it mean to release. Being able to bring all of that into play adds tons of flexibility that we didn't have if we don't build in that kind of infrastructure. Strong focus on automation across the board, unit integration, functional testing, making sure that those all play a part and are run often, and make sure that we're really validating that what we're building works and what we're building doesn't break anything that used to work. People thinking about test-driven development or behavior-driven development or acceptance test-driven development. So really looking for practices. You know, I'm a huge fan of behavior-driven development and acceptance test-driven development, because it's a wonderful way to clarify requirements before we ever start building things, and then also supports good test-driven development at the team level to write the test cases and have those failing before we write any of the code. Static code analysis, looking for things like complexity metrics or fan-in, fan-out metrics, or other things that become kind of code smells and not allowing us to check in things if those exist, or finding where they exist in this large morass of legacy code and identifying where refactoring or investment in that code is going to pay off dividends in addressing technical debt. Automated regression testing to make sure that everything is still stable. Coverage metrics and things like gated check-ins, where we need to make sure we don't fall below certain levels, or targeting coverage metrics and knowing this particular area is mission critical, really risky, or has a high history of defects. And so that coverage criteria is going to be much, much stronger than these other areas that haven't failed particularly often. And so not just necessarily blanket coverage, but also targeting those based on risk profile and importance or other considerations. Definition of done. So if you look at Les and Nexus, they're going to talk about a shared definition of done, or something I've been talking about for decades called a gold standard definition of done. It's the minimum bar that all of the teams need to be able to do and will do, where they can build a definition of done that adds more to it but doesn't take anything away. And really something that the teams all come together, agree upon, align upon, and becomes a living, breathing part of the work they're doing inside of all, you know, in their exit criteria if they're Kanban, or inside of the sprints they're doing if they're Scrum. Commonality number 3 is this idea of whole system events. So yep, team events are good, great, but we also want to make sure we're thinking about the totality of the work that we're doing. So either augmenting or replacing with whole system events that are happening. So collaborative planning, if you look at Les and you look at Nexus, that's going to be a lot more in collaborative sprint planning across teams. If you look at SAFE, that's going to be PI planning, but making sure that there's participation of the teams who are going to do the work in planning that work out, so they can A, understand the work, identify dependencies in it, and also really feel like they've got skin in the game for making the commitment that they're about to make, be that a sprint commitment or a PI commitment or a commitment to the flow metrics that they've got from the Kanban teams working together. A product level sprint review, either in addition to like SAFE ads or instead of the team sprint reviews. I've had a lot of places where they're scaled and the teams are all doing sprint reviews, but nobody's looking at the work across all of those teams. And it's such an important thing for us to be focusing on and thinking about. Plus, the stakeholders don't want to go to 15 sprint reviews of individual teams. They really want to see the totality of the features or the epics or the capability that we're building. So having that idea of, and I really like at the end of the sprint, it is fully integrated and we can show it to you and we can get your feedback. but certainly work with a number of organizations who, due to legacy reasons, are struggling to do that. And so we use more of that safe style of within the next sprint, you absolutely need to do this. Product level retrospectives. A lot of times the challenges that I see on large efforts are not things any one Scrum team can fix. These are challenges that cross all of the Agile teams, Scrum or Kanban teams in totality. So the idea of we're going to get together as a broader product organization and look at those challenges. I love the idea of sending representatives from the teams after they've done their thinking to see what kinds of things they're seeing as larger challenges and identifying those across all of the teams so that we can take action on that. I love a really simple visual radiator, like a very simple to do in process and done kind of Kanban representation where we can capture those ideas of what we need to be fixing and working on and communicate to people, here's what we're doing across all of the Agile teams underneath us to help all of them work together more effectively. Might be something to do with the build process or the continuous deployment pipeline or our automation tools that we have today. Or I was in one organization where it was literally the metrics were kind of pitting team members against each other. So those kind of things no one team can ever solve, but the leaders in the organization can. So having leadership participate in this, I'll usually think of this as something where we want attendance from product owners and scrum masters and leaders in the organization, more of a core team activity, so we can take on any kind of challenge that's really standing in the way of all of those teams contributing to the work effort we're doing. Core team meetings, Scrum of Scrum meetings, PO Sync meetings, a lot of making sure that there's some grappling and tackling on a, once a week or twice a week or whatever cadence makes sense depending on how many teams you're dealing with and how many dependencies you're dealing with across those teams. So making sure that you've got rhythms for this activity for people to talk about, well, we're about to do this and that might impact you, so you know that. Or, hey, help, what you just did really messed us up and we need your help getting that solved. So whole system events are an important part of scaling because we're not just talking about 1 or 2 teams who can talk to each other. We're talking about 5 teams, 10 teams, 50 teams, how many teams, and we need to force that collaboration, cooperation, and conversation across the larger grouping of teams. And I will say one of my favorite practices, so I will share with you my absolutely favorite practice. But before I do that, Jay, why don't we do our scaling framework poll and see what people are using now?
Okay, it looks like it's subsided.
All right, so we got a lot of safe in the house. That does not surprise me at all. It looks like Scrum at Scale and Les have about the same. Nobody here representing the Nexus. And a fair amount of custom as well, so. Great, well, so the last thing I wanted to talk about is my absolute favorite practice for scaling. Which really isn't something that comes out of the individual frameworks. It's there a little bit in SAFe, but I have some quibbles about it. My absolute favorite thing, how about Kanban? My favorite thing is program Kanban boards. And so program Kanban boards can actually scale across Scrum teams underneath it, Kanban teams underneath it, or Scrum and Kanban teams underneath it. and they model the epic or feature level, whatever that, depending on your requirements hierarchy, epics might have features or features might have epics. They're modeling that big picture across all of the teams and understanding the steps and stages it takes from the ideation to actually being able to validate that internally and maybe even externally as well. So this is a wonderful technique to show the flow of value across multiple teams, and really my go-to regardless of what the individual teams are doing. And sometimes I'll do a program board and a portfolio board as well. Sometimes the teams themselves are independent enough that I can have a flow all the way from ideation to customer validation at that individual team level. So this will depend a little bit on, the bigger you are, the more the work is interrelated and interdependent, the more we might need a program board and a portfolio board that are separate boards, thinking at separate levels. One's thinking at the level that the teams are really focusing on delivering inside of their sprints or their PIs, or they're working as a Kanban team to deliver aspects of value across this, and then a bigger picture level where we're thinking about conceptual ideas based on our strategies that we have in place and trading those off and then feeding the teams at their work level. Organizations that aren't doing continuous deployment will often have kind of a holding queue where your program board shows, say, features or epics moving across it, and those will all queue up at the end in sort of a ready to release. But your release cycle is once a quarter or every 6 months or once a year. And so a lot of work will kind of queue up there before you're actually going through the deployment process and providing that value into your customers' hands. I think that's a really interesting visual representation if we have it. I actually find that kind of fascinating, where people can literally see all that value queuing up and waiting for us to be able to release it to people. So here is an example. One of the things I don't like about SAFe is that it really comes with, here is your program Kanban board, and it gives you your steps and your stages. With Kanban, I'm a real big fan of understanding your workflow and modeling your workflow and making it look like how you work today. And so that's one of the things that I will do quite differently, even if the organization is primarily using a lot of SAFe, is I'll want to go through the step of really building a program Kanban board that truly represents how they're doing this thinking. So here, this is an example of one that had, we have ideas. We take those ideas and we basically vet them to see if this is an idea that seems like it's got some legs in it. This may be an area where we build a preliminary business case to get a sense of, yep, this does seem like it's reasonable. Then it has a proof of concept stage where we go off and we do a POC and probably validate that with some customers to make sure, hey, if we build it this way and it kind of looks like this and it does this thing, does it solve that business need that we were talking to you about? Then implementation, validation, implementation, deployment, customer validation, and done. So Bobby has a fair point. I guess the problem I see is too many people just pull SAFes out and use it as is. So thank you for correcting me. They do want you to build your own, but I see a lot of people just kind of blindly pulling and adopting what they have. And I don't want you to do that. I think it's really important, especially at this level, you understand your organization's workflow. So another example, here we have ideas again, they get evaluated, then they get analyzed, implemented, deployed, they're ready for release, they sit in that holding pen until they're actually released. I've certainly been in some organizations where there's kind of two big kinds of work that are being done. There's our ideas for where we're trying to go in the future, and then there's our customer asks that we have. Or I've been in some organization where there's kind of new work that we're doing and keep the lights on work that we're doing as well. So sometimes you'll see swim lanes here with radically different kinds of work that the teams are delivering and making sure that we understand that. I'm standing at a team right now who's actually doing keep the lights on work with their current product, but working on their major new initiative to really radically change what they deliver. And so they actually have these different lanes in it so that they can model and see that really well. And one of the huge powers here, one of the things I love about Kanban, is going through and explicitly setting exit criteria by stage. So what does it mean for us to be done evaluating an idea? And here, this example says there's a feature benefit analysis that's complete. We completed a feature template that's been reviewed and approved by the right people, and we make a go, no-go decision. So these boards often really help things like, where do we want UX playing a part in preparing features or epics for teams to consume? And where does architecture need to have a part? And how much of that work are we going to kind of do up front versus how much of that work is going to be incremental while we're implementing it? And getting all the people to agree and participate. These boards are typically looked at more from a leadership perspective, a product management perspective. They're usually looked at less frequently than what a team board would be, where you walk that board, say, every single day. Here, these program boards get walked more like once a week and are really often looking at that value flow intake activity and that validation activity at the end. We built it and we instrumented it. Are we getting the value that we expect from people? So huge thing that I really love and I use all the time, and is one of my go-to practices for helping people visualize and model value flow at scale. Right, so in conclusion, SAFE is definitely the big kid on the block in terms of best support for large product enterprise considerations. We've got a lot in there in terms of portfolio management. A lot of the roles that people are looking for enterprises are in there. Less in Nexus, you really can think of it as Scrum scaled up. It still looks a lot like Scrum. It feels a lot like Scrum. It's Scrum, but with more teams delivering value underneath a Scrum umbrella and way of thinking. SAFE, in my experience, is way more than you need if your scaling challenge is 5 teams. So if you're small organizations, small teams, I'm going to go back to my practices and look for the practices that really help us provide value and address the challenges that are happening at those individual team levels. And SAFE is definitely the most prescriptive and I think hardest for people to know how to tailor. There's been some industry studies. I'd need to go find it. If you're interested, email me, I can find it. Some industry studies done about, is it harder to scale a process down or scale a process up? And it is much harder for people to scale a process down than it is to take a simpler process and add things to it. And then a lot of that is you kind of have to be a process wonk. You have to be pretty deep into these things to know which pieces can I take out and I'm safe, which pieces do I take out and the wheels fall apart at this. And a lot of people will go in and just potentially adopt more than they need. And so it is important that you recognize that SAFE is meant to be a framework. It is meant to be tailored. I'll often work with people to sort of incrementally adopt the things inside of it that make sense based on the current challenge we're seeing versus going all in immediately just because of that particular reason. So the big challenge here is not really a Agile challenge. In many ways, I think Agile has actually made this easier and better, right? At the individual team level, if the individual components work better, scaling is easier than it was. It's that scaling is hard. Large stuff is hard. It's complicated. It's often legacy, riddled with a lot of dependencies, just much more challenging for us to manage and plan and deal with. That individual, high quality individual teams is a real key for helping make sure that you're building upon something that's stable and strong and you can add to versus trying to work on something where your foundation is falling apart. SAFE, definitely the big kid on the block, but established for very, very large product teams. So, you know, just use it when it makes a lot of sense, use it in the right places, it can really sing, use it in the wrong places and people feel like it's way more than they ever needed or wanted and can be problematic that way. Right, and I like common practices. And I also love the idea of, Ron said, program Kanban boards look like what product management wants even in one team situations. Nothing stops you from being able to use that concept at a single team level, multi-team level, portfolio level. Wonderful thing for people to be thinking about. I don't think it's safe or Lexus or Nexus, which is the problem. It's the concept of people buying into delivering something substantial. You know, all of the frameworks want you to incrementally deliver value. They're structured in somewhat different ways. They have different practices, but that's a thought process that people need to really embrace. I find it's not hard to get people to embrace it because we can talk about all the risks that we have when we don't incrementally deliver value and how things go off the rails often. I was working with an organization a couple years ago that had 20 Scrum teams in 6 locations around the world, 6 months into a 12-month release. And they couldn't even, they had, I think, like 360 epics, of which 5 or 6 were done. So I think if you understand the problem you're trying to solve, you can get a lot of buy-in from the teams who want to be successful and from the leadership who wants to mitigate risk and better optimize value delivery. I'm not sure I can yet differentiate and choose between less and Nexus help. They're awfully similar animals in many ways. So I personally lean a little bit more towards Nexus just because I like its focus of the Nexus integration team and a strong focus there. But I think if one or the other resonates with you more, I think they're sort of a, would you like a Granny Smith apple or a Pink Lady apple? They're in the same family and they're going to provide you a lot of the same general approaches, general methodologies, general solutions, and general patterns. Other questions for me? You're also welcome to unmic and turn your camera on and say hello and ask a question. Are the Nexus integration teams similar to the system teams in SAFe? There's a really interesting nuance here in that in SAFe, most of the time, a way I've seen it done is it's a separate team and they're really responsible for taking the delivery of the individual Scrum teams, integrating that all together and getting it ready for the system delivery. So they're doing a lot of that integration work, where the Nexus integration team is not responsible for necessarily doing any of the work of integrating. They're there to support, mentor, coach, guide, provide tooling, provide infrastructure, and do other things that enable the teams to integrate. I'm sure there are people doing SAFe where the systems integration team looks just like a Nexus integration team, which would be awesome. I think that would be a wonderful pattern to have if you were more on the SAFe side of the world. But in a lot of the larger legacy organizations I've been in, it's an entirely separate set of people, and their charter is less about enabling the Scrum and Kanban teams on the art and more about actually doing the integration work. Am I a fan for a single product backlog for all teams? Yes, absolutely. The concept of a master product backlog has been one that I have been a big fan of for years. The tools nowadays give us a wonderful ability to look at the totality of it and then also have every team have their own view into it. So teams don't have to look at, say, a couple thousand items or more. They can see they're a small part of the whole, But if I'm a program manager or a product manager or a stakeholder, I can filter my backlog to be looking more at that feature or epic view that crosses multiple teams.
Hey, Jenny, this is Jay. Let me add one thing to the less decision. So, so Greg and Boss have been very communicative on. They're about organization change and organization design. It's about the feature teams. And Craig has said many, many times, get rid of all the project manager, program managers in the organization immediately. So less is more about changing your organizational structure. Change your organizational structure, you'll change your culture. And they're big proponents of that.
Yep.
However, they don't have, to what you said before, Jenny, you know, the organizational change practices and methods to do that. They do talk about some of it, and they are about a lot of system thinking. But I just want to say that less is a, you know, that's their big deal, is that for you to be agile, you have to change your organization, change your culture, and then create feature teams.
Yep. Although I have seen a few places where they're using it and haven't done that shift in totality. So
Exactly.
And I think everybody's a huge proponent of feature teams, right? I mean, the more we can have the individual teams be able to have ownership of soup to nuts of something they can deliver that's customer value, the easier this all becomes. The more you need 3, 4, 5 teams delivering pieces of something before you see customer value, the harder all of this becomes. So feasible in any way, it's just whether how big of a challenge it's going to be, how much you, for dependency management, one of the things I'm always looking at is I'm looking at the requirements decomposition and flow, because I want to see if there are ways that I can better manage how we decompose the backlog. If you don't like the word requirements, epic stories, features, how we decompose those and feed those to the teams to better be able to understand our dependencies, better be able to manage those dependencies. And then if we look at the teams, seeing if there are ways we can restructure the teams to dissolve the dependencies that are causing us the most pain is a wonderful thing for everybody who's in large scale to be thinking about.
So if you have any questions, you can chat it, or you can open up your mic and just ask. We've got a few more minutes left.
It looks like somebody suggested a nice paper comparing scaling agile frameworks based on underlying practices. So also if people have other resources that would be useful or helpful to people, drop them in chat. I think that's always it's great to learn what resources other people have used that have helped them.
Hey, Jenny, I think there is a question on portfolio management in the chat.
How is portfolio management PMP different from safe portfolio? Only the roles differ. I don't have enough current knowledge of the PMP portfolio management structure and thinking to give a good answer to that question.
I can provide some insight a little bit. So on PMP, on the portfolio management, they do that by creating a bunch of project plans, whatever tool you want to use, and then they aggregate all of the phases and schedules up, as well as all the resource demands, and they create a portfolio. Now, generally, they create the portfolio first that aligns all of the projects they're going to do, the phases and tasks. Then they create the project plans and they re-aggregate up and we create a portfolio plan. And I've done this before. It's a huge, giant project management plan.
Ouch.
and we manage it. And there's a lot of other actions we do, especially in the resource and demand and capacity dimensions. And lean portfolio management, we of course, you all know this, in Agile, we shy away from having project plans. Okay, this is not something we agree to do. And that is a huge difference between us and the project management PMI discipline. Okay, so there is some significant differences between the two. I would like to argue that the way we do lean portfolio management, and how we do portfolio management as far as strategic investments, and how we integrate experimentation and design thinking and so forth, is different and fundamentally different in thinking than the Project Management Institute, because I did that portfolio management for PMI for years, and I can testify that it is different.
So we also had a comment about the Spotify model for scaling Agile. I know that it was kind of all of a rage for a little while. We actually had someone at, we do an executive summit every year for VPs, SVPs, engineering leaders in organizations to come together and present. And we had someone come and talk about the Spotify model recently, last year, I believe, maybe the year before. And his really interesting comment was, it's not the model that made it work for Spotify. It was the culture of Spotify that really enabled this to sing in our organization, which made me really happy, because when I first looked at the whole Spotify paper, I kind of looked at it and said, org structure, communities of practice called guilds, org structure with kind of different names on it. Why is everybody so excited about all of this? But getting some insight into the cultural aspects that really made things sing there, I thought was very insightful and very interesting. So I think, there's certainly ideas in the Spotify model that are worth thinking about, those independent areas that can deliver business value. I think the idea of communities of practice where you share knowledge, and if you like the word guild, call it a guild, where you share knowledge across an entire train or multiple trains or entire organization or multiple organizations. Rewarding and recognizing people as part of their professional development for leading all of those, I think makes a ton of sense. So again, I would look at that model more for kind of the concepts behind it rather than trying to take it as a blueprint for scaling. I think there's a lot of things missing in it for a blueprint for scaling. The new way of working, remote practices gaining momentum. Yeah, I'm not sure this is going to be a new way of working. I think this might be a shift that has a lot of totality in it for a long time, where we become much more remote and distributed as an industry for a long period of time, even after we can go back into the office. Do I think big transformation will suffer? I think we are pretty adaptive. We are good at learning. We are going to find that there's certain things that work really well for us. We're also going to see that where we see gaps and where we see challenges is where we begin to express those as areas we need much better support for. The tooling vendors will step up, and I think we'll see them improve. I think we'll learn some of the patterns for this kind of stuff works well remotely, this kind of stuff doesn't, right? Day-to-day things like checking in and doing daily scrums, daily stand-ups, daily Kanbans, remote, no problem, fine. Doing distributed PI planning, probably always going to be a real pain, and we're going to want to try and do those in person together as much as possible because they're not terribly frequent, and they have a huge impact on our ability to successfully deliver something. So I think we will see a real mix here. And I have actually been pretty impressed with what some of the tools can do even now.
Okay, I'm counting down, Jenny, to see how long we can wait on questions before we go and have a cocktail.
It's time for your evening beverage of choice, be that wine, beer, cocktail, or water. Jay, should I send you a PDF of the slides to distribute to the group? Would that be helpful? I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, sure. You can do that. And so what I'll do is I'll take that. So what I'll do is we have a YouTube account. I'll put the video file out there and send it to everyone. And then I'll send a note to everyone in Meetup with a link to the YouTube and a link to the PowerPoint or the Acrobat presentation.
Perfect. Sounds great.
And one more question, Jenny. How many product managers do we actually need? More than one, it sounds like.
I would need contextual information to give a decent answer to that question. And there's all sorts of other things, like I've been in some organizations where a lot of the product owners ended up being in product management. The product management organization kind of had people who were more strategic customer roadmap future and people who were really active product owners. And I've seen that work really, really well in some places. I've also seen places where that was a real challenge, or the product management organization wasn't staffed up to do it, or had no interest in it, or had no interest in it 3 years ago, but now has interest in it. So I think there's a lot of nuances there that make it hard to give a, here's my answer.
Well, so where I'm throwing it out was less. You called out less as having a single product owner, and I consider product owners to be a subset of product management. Does Nexus also have a single product owner?
Correct. Yes.
And so how do they deal with that? I mean, you know, single teams can run a single product manager ragged. You know, a team that's really firing, a software development team that's really firing,
Yep.
can be knocking off stories faster than product owners can write them and do acceptance and do all of. I mean, there's a huge amount of work that product owners do.
And that's why it is the most common criticism of those frameworks. If you've got teams who are able to write the stories themselves, they're able to talk directly to the business. If they take on a fair amount of the individual team product ownership role, that's what you need to be able to make less and Nexus work. You can't just assume that this one product owner for these 8 teams is going to write all stories for all 8 teams.
And so, sorry, who takes that on?
The teams do.
The teams themselves do.
The teams themselves take on a lot of product, what has historically been peer or vast majority of product ownership activities.
It's kind of fundamental to less, right?
What? Sorry?
It's kind of fundamental to less that the teams take on that role that Ron was talking about.
Yep.
Because I was curious, adding on to Ron's question, what I found with the places that I work with, the weak link, and this is not even thinking about just scaling, but just in Agile, is getting good product owners.
Yeah. I have a coworker, he's since moved to Australia and left us, but when he taught Scrum Boot Camp, he used to have a picture of a unicorn with a kittens on its back and a rainbow behind it. And he said, finding the perfect product owner is like finding a scrumicorn. So yeah, I agree with you. And, you know, honestly, it's one of the things that I think is concerning to me about LESS and Nexus is just to make sure that everybody understands the shift that we are now asking these teams to take, and can they do that, and can they do it successfully, or are we setting these teams up for failure? And it would be better to structure a group of teams where you had a chief product owner and you had product owners working with 1 or 2 Scrum teams who report into a chief product owner with a master product backlog. And so we go for that pattern instead of going, you know, in on one of the scaling frameworks. So again, I think it really comes down to like looking at the teams, looking at the situation, looking at the kind of work they're doing, looking at the capabilities and interests of the people, and making sure you don't just force fit the wrong framework into an organization. That's going to be really problematic. I was reading something by somebody recently who had been a product owner working with like 4 or 5 Scrum teams, and they had just all suddenly shifted to SAFe, and he was just absolutely fuming that basically his responsibilities had been completely decimated by their move to SAFe, right? And if everybody else had felt like him, that's a really bad change in the organization. That's not what you want. If you had been very successful, that organization, assuming they were very successful, would have been better suited by something like LESS or Nexus that built upon what was already working really well for them.
Yeah, and this is Jay. I'm going to be frank here that I don't think any of the frameworks do product management justice. A product school, you know, what Marty Kagan is doing, and mind the product and so forth. It's become now a discipline and a profession. Most product owners or product managers I talk to, they do not want to write user stories. That is the furthest thing from what their profession is. Okay, it's about bringing a product to the market, understanding the customer, and there's a lot of stuff they got to do that, and then come back to the teams and work with them. But they spend most of their time with the customers and the market, right, and determining what the product should be and what it can grow up to be, right? So I think this is a big debate in the Agile community right now. And I've had these debates with many people I will not name that think that a product person can work with a Scrum team and write the user stories, and work with the customer and work with the market and determine how to change and disrupt the market with new products. Oh, you could do all that in a 40-hour week. I don't think so.
With 20
Most of them have business
teams.
analysts that do all that work for them, Jay.
What? Go ahead.
I said most of them have business analysts that do all that work for them, Jay.
Right, but then what's the vice president of banking deposits doing? He should be out there in the market and understanding the bank industry and understanding how to improve deposits for that bank. I'm picking on Andrew. and that he's the product manager.
Yeah.
I think that you probably have a very interesting panel discussion in your future.
Do we have business analysts on the LESS teams and the Nexus teams?
There's no specific, you will staff these teams with a BA to step in and do some of the product owner work. But I have definitely seen that happening in places where the teams have an individual or a business analyst supports a couple teams, and then there's that chief product owner. So it's one pattern that I've seen to help bridge that gap of the teams need more support and assistance than just one person across 8 teams could ever possibly provide. But one of the other ones is the team, the entire team steps up. There's no business analyst on it. The whole team steps up to take on some of that work.
Yeah, hi, this is Andrew again. The reason I brought that up is we have a number of opportunities, I'll call them, at work right now that we're exploring. A couple of programs, pretty big ones. There's a couple pieces missing on both programs, but you know, I'm hoping that we can kind of lead them into it. You know, I think what I gained from tonight's discussion is a lot of these, there's a lot of similarities between these frameworks. There's a Venn diagram effect. And I think that, you know, the closer that we can get them to do it without them even knowing, at least in my case, it's probably our best chance for success. So I really appreciate the, you know, kind of allowing me to kind of pull back in my thinking and not being so close to the screen all the time, and thinking beyond, you know, just kind of what you're doing from day to day. Because I do think that a lot of these different frameworks that you outlined today are, you know, you can take pieces and parts of it and apply it to your own situation.
Yep.
You know, certainly in my case, and be successful. And I think
Yeah.
that's really ultimately what we're trying to do. It's kind of like, you know, there are only so many chords, but you can combine them into so many different songs. You know, it really is remarkable.
Well, my philosophy is always step one, identify what hurts. Step two, solve that. Step three, if it's really big, find a sub-way that you can divide it so that you can do something useful in a short period of time that helps move you forward. And I'm less about, okay, we have to do this particular one thing or do this one particular way. I really like to have my toolbox I take with me and pull out the pieces that make the most sense in the current situation and that we can leverage fast.
If I can add one thing to this, Jenny, first of all, this was one of the best presentations I've seen talking about frameworks. So thank you, because I've been studying this for a while. Because I'm trying to help one of my own clients scale out 17 teams, and the culture is a major roadblock. It really it has to fit within the culture. But the one takeaway I came from this is by looking at all these frameworks, what it does is if you can abstract out what they're all trying to do, you can find some commonalities in these frameworks. And there's some things that you can effectively inspect and adapt on to start teasing certain things out. For example, you know, things like, you know, having a whole product backlog, assuming that it's one product, ensuring that the product owners have synchronization around that backlog, putting in Scrum of Scrums where it's necessary, figuring out how to manage those dependencies and things. And there's others that they're all trying to do. And maybe instead of just taking one big, huge thing going, oh, we're going to implement this, and oh, we have to put all these roles in place, maybe doing things more incrementally might be the easier thing to do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you look at where your organization is and what people have decided. If you're at a place where we have pain and we want to incrementally address that, let's do that. I have been in organizations where there has been a business decision that they are moving to SAFe, and so it's about figuring out the right way to incrementally adopt that that's going to provide them the most value as they take that journey. I've been in other places where the leadership just wants to understand what are the pros and cons, and so giving them a sense for here are the frameworks, here's where they're a good fit, here's where there are challenges, and helping them make the decision on what's best for them. Everybody's going to be in a different place, and I do think it is all about trying to find the next thing that is going to be useful to us in terms of more successful outcomes of our projects, our programs, and our products.
I posted a URL to the CTO Summit this morning. That was 4 talks, one of which was from the VP of Engineering at Clubhouse, who implemented Spotify. And in the audience was Kevin Goldsmith, who was the VP of engineering at the time at Spotify, at the point at which Nieberg wrote the paper. And Kevin pointed out that the paper was a point in time description of what Spotify was doing at
Yep.
that point in time. And that what Spotify really was is what I think we want all of our organizations to be, which is evolving organizations, constantly looking for what works, to Jenny, to your point, to what's not working, and let's fix that thing. And now what does that reveal? It's peeling the onion, removing the impediments,
Yep.
looking for the blockages in flow to go to the original lean model that
Yeah.
everything that we do is based on. Is what's the biggest blockage to flow?
Yeah, we want to be the organization who went to a Toyota factory and didn't just look at how they had implemented it today and then put that on our floor and then went back there 5 years later and wondered, well, why have you changed this thing in your flow? Why did you do that? We want to be the organization who's like Toyota, who was saying, hey, this is a learning journey. It's ever evolving as the situation we're in changes, as the market changes, as we change. We are also going to learn and evolve and adapt and change.
And just remember, it was a Swedish culture. Doesn't always translate into other cultures.
And to go to one of Nieberg's comments, Nieberg said, it's not our process, it's our process for evolving our process.
But now we might be getting into process walk territory, which I'm very happy to be in. But a lot of people just want this stuff to help them get their job done, right? It's like, I'm not about just give me a tool that's helpful for me so I can actually get back to work and do what I wanted to do in the first place.
And I think that's part of the problem is that's where it falls into practices instead of mindset. That's where it falls into doing Agile instead of being Agile. That's where it falls into, well, we're Agile, we have daily stand-ups. And it's like, not so much.
Okay, I'm going to put my Scrum Master hat on, and I'm going to say, well, I think we're at the end of our, journey, and I want to thank Jenny for coming here and for sharing herself and her experiences with us. It's fantastic. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I'm very happy to have been here today.
Thank you. And then, so we'll send out the recording to everyone if I can remember. And we'll send out the deck as soon as Jenny sends it to me. And we're going to stay in contact because we're a community. We're a community of fellows that are serious about changing the world. And we're going to do that, hopefully into a better place. And we're going to go from there. So our next meeting is going to be with Diana Larson. We're going to talk about retrospectives, one of Diana's favorite things to talk about.
I'm excited. I want to join that one. That sounds awesome. That's one of my favorite topics too.
She wrote the book on it.
Yep.
Yes. I was just watching your five issues recording, Jenny, and your retrospective stuff is great.
Perfect. And so thank you everyone that has attended. Hopefully you got value out of this. Stay tuned. We have more coming up. Diana's coming up, and we'll have more after this. And if you have any ideas of what you want to hear about, who you want to hear from, send us a note, and we'll try to accommodate and be a good servant leader. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Have a cocktail.
All right. Excellent. I'm off.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jimmy. Bye-bye.